Welcome everyone to the special public meeting, and I call this meeting to order, and we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, and today's meeting is focused on a stormwater management fee presentation. So I'm going to just go ahead and hand things over. Okay, come on up, Courtney.
Check, check, it's working. Okay, all right. Are we going to show the presentation on the screen? Okay, I'll give them a minute. All right, great, there we go. So thank you all for attending, and thank you to the board for having us here and inviting us here tonight. We're really excited to talk through a pretty important topic here for the township residents and for those in attendance, the stormwater fee program. And so we have a pretty full agenda, and I am going to keep talking through the feedback, but I want to give you a quick overview. Why are we here tonight? At the core, we're here to sort of build off of the outreach that began with the board's meetings about a year ago, late winter, early spring 2022, and really describe some of the technical work that has been performed to date. We're going to introduce the program, talk about a vision and a timeline, and I'll present a brief overview of some issues that the township has been facing. Andrew Potts from Jacobs will be presenting the program description and the cost of services, and Lawrence Vandertak from Jacobs will present some key policy recommendations and some of the input we've had from the advisory group. Ellen will present some legal considerations, and then we will open it up to questions. So I do ask that you all hold your questions until the end of our presentations, and we're hoping to get through this in about 30 minutes. 45 is our max. And so when we think about the purpose of a stormwater fee, we crafted a vision statement. And the vision statement really is the guiding principle of all of the work that we've done to date. And the vision is to provide a strategically timed, reliable, and equitable funding source to meet Tredyffrin Township's short-term, 1 to 5 years, as well as the long-term, which is 5 to 20 years, stormwater program needs. And these include the regulatory requirements, the capital needs for drainage upgrades and flooding improvements, as well as regular operations and maintenance activities. And we're really going to dive into those a little bit here shortly. And so, you know, we started the technical work in the fall, in September 2022, but there's been a lot of work done before that, and we're really about at the 50-yard line. We're right in the middle of our proposed schedule, and we spent a lot of time in the fall and the winter doing some of the technical analyses for the program, the rate structure. We've met with the advisory group, and we're headed into the spring and summer where we're going to do some outreach and really work towards the goal of ending with an ordinance for a decision with some public hearings in the winter. And so when we think about the why, you know, why are we doing this? There's a lot of reasons, and we're going to go through them, and the first one is deferred maintenance. The challenge that the township is facing with the maintenance needs and the need for some regular and routine maintenance, it's a necessary service to keep the system, the stormwater system, functioning. One storm can really deposit a large amount of leaves and trash and sediment, and that can clog the system. The system is the stormwater system of pipes and inlets, and that can cause some impacts downstream. And so street sweeping and inlet cleaning are an important service that the township provides the residents and the community members, and that's not only to have a high quality of life and a high quality of service, but to meet your pollution reduction plan permitted requirements. And to meet those needs, the township is investing in new equipment and resources. And then when you think of maintenance, there's a lot of out of sight, out of mind systems here. So the township, in like municipalities across the state, has a lot of corrugated metal pipe. This infrastructure, these assets are over 40 years old, and there's a significant amount of corrosion and degradation. And this infrastructure, in order to be maintained, requires inspection, repair, and maintenance, and replacement. And this will help provide a continued level of service to the residents in the community. And I don't need to tell you that the flooding impacts associated with climate change are a severe challenge here to the township. We have these flashy storms. They're higher volume, short duration storms, and they're causing substantial financial impacts, and it's here in the township and it's across the state. The graph on the left simply shows the billion-dollar extreme weather events across Pennsylvania over the last 40 years, and you can just see that bar is just increasing over time. And then on the other side, you have these 1,000-year storms. Back in 2021, we had the August 19th and the September 1st storms. Those are low probability storms, but they're happening with greater frequency. And so these are causing damaging and they're causing impacts to the township that are impacting property owners of all types. And not only are they impacting property owners of all types, but they're impacting you everywhere. It's not just in the low-lying zones of Trout Creek, like shown in the middle here at Richard Roads, but it's in the upper portions of the headwaters. It's shown at the main branch along Old State Road. And then on top of that, you have right-of-way issues that are flooded. You've got culverts that are backed up and roadways that are impassable, and then even our railroad corridors are impacted. And so, the flooding is certainly important, but then on the other side, you have the regulatory reality. Every municipality in Pennsylvania is required to have a stormwater permit to discharge stormwater into the streams. This permit requires the township to implement measures which are projects and activities that reduce and prevent runoff, polluted runoff, from entering the creek. And so on the climate change flooding side, you have quantity of water, and then the permits making the township and others deal with the quality of the water. And this permit is renewed every 5 years, and there's a number of projects and activities that are associated with it. And all in all, this just is leading to the financial challenge the township is facing, which is that the cost of providing the municipal services is increasing faster than the revenue. And then on top of it, you've got the capital needs for drainage upgrades and flood mitigation and culvert replacements and stormwater projects. Those projects those costs are increasing. And so this really leads us to the need for a dedicated funding source for stormwater. And so, what is a stormwater fee? Why is the township even considering this? It boils down to a dedicated funding mechanism, and its goal is to reduce the reliance on the general fund. It really is an equitable strategy whereby the stormwater fees are based on the amount of stormwater a property owner or property generates, and that's usually defined by the amount of impervious area, the roadways, the sidewalks, the rooftops, the driveways, and whatnot. It's not typically based on property value, water or sewage usage, or even tax status. And it really helps the township provide integrated infrastructure so that you can achieve the multiple goals associated with operations and maintenance, the needs to rehabilitate your assets, as well as achieve your regulatory compliance.
So what has been discussed and recommended to date? I'll walk you through this. Been a great process working with the Stormwater Advisory Group. We've been meeting with them over the last several months. It's a diverse group of stakeholders representing major stakeholders across the township, We've met, we're gonna meet 5 to 6 times throughout this process. We've met 4 times so far, starting back in December, and then the 5th meeting is actually just next week. And the purpose is really to provide input and guidance on key policy issues, to identify additional policies if appropriate, and to ultimately make recommendations to the Board of Supervisors. We're going to touch on many of the policy issues you see on the right, and we're going to start tonight, and we're going to start with what is funded by the program and at what cost of service. And when we talk about the stormwater program, as Courtney alluded to, there's an operational side to that and then the capital project side of that. We'll start with the projects. First and foremost, these are projects that we're looking at to address all those drivers that Courtney discussed: flood mitigation, drainage improvements, funding, and regulatory compliance. And they're kind of fall into different project types. There's the actual new infrastructure capital projects, there's engineering that goes into those projects, planning, funding, design, etc. And there's that repair and replacement that Courtney was talking, or R&R for short. This is a very small font. Don't worry about digesting all of it, but this is just to give you a sense that the budget and the projects and the cost of service were based on these projects from the Township's capital improvement plan, and they're used for budgetary planning purposes. Of course, things are going to change over the years, but this is a really good starting point. Totals up $22 million, and when we start talking about the cost of service levels on the next slide, realize that all of these projects are included in all those cost of services. It just depends on how quickly we're going to get them implemented. So we came up with 3 cost of service levels working with the advisory group: baseline, moderate, and high cost of service. And again, from the capital side, those reflect different durations. So the highest capital needs is looking at all those projects being initiated within 5 years. A moderate spreads out over 8 years, and a baseline spreads it out over 12 years. They all include funding for both emergency flood response as well as that R&R that we've talked about. On the operational side of the program, the AG had some really good input here, and they really wanted these cost of service levels to focus more on those capital needs, less on an enhanced operation and maintenance activities, things like doing additional street sweeping. And they also recommended that there be, recognize the need of having an increased administration or staffing support to cover the faster pace of projects in those medium and high cost of service levels on the capital side. So additional administration to support that capital program. And that's what's reflected in the bar charts here. So the medium and high, the moderate and high in this case are the same. They include that additional support, and the baseline does not. Not dramatic differences here on the operational side. When you roll it all together, you can kind of describe the 3 cost of service levels in this way. Again, that baseline takes all those stormwater projects, or at least the funding for those, spreads it over 12 years to address all those drivers we've been talking about, in addition to the operations and maintenance activities. The moderate speeds that up down to 8 years, adds that additional administrative support, and the high further accelerates things and keeps in that enhanced administration to run the program, support the program. So when we roll all those numbers up and do the cost estimates for everything, you can see the 3 levels here: baseline, moderate, and high. At a very simple level, baseline averages out to be $2.8 million per year, moderate 3.4, and high at just under 4.3 million. Now, the advisory group recommended that medium level, so you can see we kind of shaded out those baseline and high and focused in on that moderate level. And the ultimate conclusion was they felt that that moderate funding addressed the need for flood control and drainage improvements, but also kind of considered and took into account the fact that the staffing and delivery capacity constraints and increased fees might make it hard to go much beyond this moderate cost of service level, even if you'd want to do things faster, just the practicality of that.
Thank you, Andy. Now we're going to talk about how we go from those program budget levels to how you actually calculate the fee and reflect your priorities through some of the policy choices that we evaluated with the advisory group. So I'm going to start out by talking specifically about how the stormwater fee is determined. I've done a lot of stormwater utilities over the years, and each one is a little different, but they all have the same basic elements as reflected here. First of all, if you use an impervious fee basis for them, which is most of them, that's one of the key elements. Essentially, that's because that is a measure of the amount of stormwater runoff that comes from a given property. So impervious area for a given property is a key measure of how much stormwater runoff occurs. What is your contribution? Of course, the other key element is the program budget that Andy just spoke about. So that's one part of the equation. And lastly, there are some key policy decisions that affect the overall rates that would be established. And we'll talk through some of them in the next few slides. So what is the rate structure? Are there exemptions provided? Rate caps, credits, and incentives? All those things play into what a given property might see in terms of what their fee is. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So the rate structure analysis fundamentally is intended to balance two key considerations, equity and ease of implementation. It needs to be fair and simple. I mean, every single stormwater utility I've been involved with, those are the key elements that make them successful. But there's a lot of elements to that. For instance, residential properties, you can either have a flat fee or tiered rate structure, and I'll explain that some more in the next few slides. Non-residential multifamily could also use a similar tiered rate structure, so everyone's treated the same. But again, there's nuances to that. Typically, undeveloped properties with no impervious area would not be assessed a fee. So you've heard me mention impervious area a few times. Just wanted to show you a map of what the impervious surfaces are here in Tredyffrin. The top image there shows a typical situation if you zoom into a given property. So shows the boundaries of the property, and then red and yellow shows the buildings, other impervious area. You might have roads. That is the impervious area for any given property. In the time that I've been doing this, over 30 years, the ability of mapping this information has gotten much, much, much better. So we're able to be a lot more precise about doing those measurements. Why is charging based on impervious area equitable and the most common approach? Well, if you look in this graphic on the left-hand side, about 90% of all the parcels in the town are single-family properties. But if you look at that slice on the right-hand side, the yellow on the right-hand side, it's about 43% of all the impervious area. So that 90% represents less than half of the impervious area in the township. Look at commercial, for instance. Commercial is about 5.5% of all the parcels, but they represent about 35% of the impervious area. So this gives a fundamental reason why impervious area is really the primary approach to assessing stormwater fees. It's equitable because it reflects everyone's contribution to stormwater runoff. There have been surveys done around the United States. There's over 3,000 stormwater fee-based programs. 87% of those are based on impervious area as their primary metric for assessing fees. All with some nuances based on the policies that we're going to talk through in the next few slides, but that's sort of the key message with this. Just to show you, again, going back to the map, the colors here show the different types of properties. The yellow shows all the single-family homes in Tredyffrin. I think the red is the commercial properties. So again, you see where those different types of properties are represented here in the township. So taking that data, we've done an analysis of what is the distribution of impervious area for different types of parcels. The graphic on the left is a bit complicated, so I'll explain it. And the vertical axis shows the number of parcels and every single slice. So the very first slice is everything up to 1,000 square feet. The next one, 1,000 and 2,000. And you can see there's a very wide distribution. This is, again, for single-family homes, a wide distribution of the amount of impervious area for different types of properties here in the township. The median, shown there by the vertical bar, is about 4,046 square feet. So just to give you a graphic representation of that, on the right, it shows sort of a boundary of a property, house area, other area, adds up to 4,046. You'll see that the proportionality or the equity is all tied to how much that impervious area is for different types of properties. So what does that distribution look like when you get to non-residential properties, multifamily residential properties? So again, we have the distribution of the number of properties in different slices, and you see it's not this sort of bell curve, it's spread out. And the black line shows the number of properties, it's the cumulative percentage. And if you can make it out, 40% of all the non-residential properties are more than 19,000 square feet. And in the less than 19,000, it's pretty evenly distributed in all those different size property classes. So the chart on the right is made up, but essentially it's this is an example where if they were to add up to 40,460 square feet, 10 times the number I gave you before for typical single-family property, if you use an impervious fee, this property would pay 10 times that amount. And we'll come back to that as we talk through different rate structures in the next few slides. So working with the advisory group, we talked through 3 different rate structure alternatives or options. The first one is what's referred to as the ERU rate structure. If you go back to the slide I had 2 slides ago, ERU means equivalent residential units. It's essentially a typical residence measured by that 4,046 square foot value. So measured by the median of single family homes. Under this rate structure approach, which historically was the more common one because they didn't have very good measurements, all single family homes would be assessed the same fee based on that metric. So regardless of the size of the property, they would all pay the same fee regardless of the size. And that's what the chart on the top shows for single family homes. Everyone would pay whatever the value is, $10 per ERU, whatever the number is. And then for non-single family homes, non-residential, multifamily residential, in that case, this method, you would take their actual impervious area, divide it by 4,046, so you figure out the number of those ERUs represents a given property, and they would pay in direct proportion to that value. So to summarize the advantages, this approach is simple to administer, it's simple to explain, there's fairly minimal data management, but it's not as equitable. I mean, essentially a house that's 2,000 square feet would pay the same thing as a house that's 20,000 square feet of impervious area. So again, this used to be common when mapping data wasn't so good, but we have much better mapping data than we used to have. So that's not where we've ended up in terms of the advisory group recommendation, which is this one. This is an impervious area tier-based method. So in this case, essentially, properties are put into different buckets or tiers based on property size. The first tier runs 500 to 1,000 square feet. The reason for that 500 is simply that small impervious area values are very uncommon, and it's a lot to administer for 2 cents on the dollar. It's just not worth it. And we'll talk about that some more. But all the other tiers basically are in even 1,000 square foot increments. So tiers 2 through 7, 1,000, 2,000, 2,000, 3,000. Within each one of those tiers, everyone would pay the same amount. But if you're, say, in tier 2, which is up to 2,000 square feet, and then tier 4, 4,000 square feet, tier 4 would pay twice the amount of tier 2. It's because it's 2 times the amount of impervious area. And then when you get above that threshold, essentially, by the way, this applies to residential and non-residential. Doesn't matter if you're a business and so forth, in a single-family residential. If you're in a given tier, you pay the same thing. And we'll give you some examples here in a moment. So advantages here, it's fair and equitable. You have a better representation of the actual amount of runoff from a given property because it represents the amount of impervious area. It applies to all properties, so if your house is the same square footage as a business across the street, you're going to pay the same amount as that property. Disadvantage, it does require a little bit more work up front to put properties into each of those tiers. And if you're right at the boundary, say you're 2,005 square feet, you might be right on the boundary, you might think you need to be in a different tier. But once you figure that stuff out up front, it's pretty simple to administer. The third option is kind of a nuance of that same tier-based approach. It's called the intensity of development approach. And in this case, you're adding in the aspect of what is the percentage of impervious area of a given property. So let's just say you're 4,000 square foot property. One sits on a property that's 10% impervious. The other one is 80% impervious. So you see in the chart on the top there, we've actually mapped out the percentage of imperviousness of all the different properties within the township. And we put them into 3 categories where the light, meaning low imperviousness, is 0 to 10%. Moderate is 10 to 50%, which is the vast majority. And then there's a few that are very impervious in the top category. and you can develop rates that reflect those differences. This is also fair and equitable, but it is definitely more data intensive. You have to figure out that percent impervious in addition to the actual square footage of impervious area for a given property. So it's not as easy to administer or explain. And it basically assumes the relative impact of stormwater varies based on the intensity of development. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, we could get into detailed discussions of that, and happy to do that later on. But that's where stormwater engineers like to get into a lot of details of stormwater runoff. So I want to jump to what does that mean for those three different cost of service numbers, and then I'll give you some actual examples from actual properties. Well, so we've calculated what the fee is for a typical home, that median home we were talking about before, 4,046 square feet. And let's just focus on the middle two bars there. You'll see there's two bars. One is on the right shows if the capital improvement program budget, the project budget, is not bond funded. In other words, the township does not issue bonds to spread out the costs over time. So in that case, the charge for a typical home would be about $207 per year. And in the other case, if they do issue bonds, which is fairly common as well, it could be $137. Ultimately, that's the township's choice. Which one they choose is up to you all up here to decide. And you can see how that varies between the baseline cost of service and the high cost of service. So again, for a typical home, $137 to $207, depending on whether the capital is bond funded or not. And that's a policy choice the town would need to consider. This presents that same information, but across all the different tiers, again, focusing on the tier method. In this case, includes the bond funding. And so you can see for a tier 1 property, that smallest property at less than 1,000 square feet, you're looking at $23 per year, 46, 76, and so forth. Let's get up to the top end. So a 10,000 square foot property of impervious area would be looking at about $300 per year to fund that median level service. One key point I want to make is all of those different options would raise the same amount of revenue. They're all set up to essentially meet the moderate level service, which is the recommendation, or if you choose a high level service, you could set it up to provide the same revenue based on those different policy choices. So I'm going to summarize those, and then I'm going to get into some specific examples. So as I mentioned, we evaluated 3 very commonly used rate structure options. The equivalent residential unit approach, which used to be the most common, the tiered approach, which is all the more recent stormwater utilities have gone to that approach because it's more equitable, and then the intensity of development approach is used in some parts of the country, but it's fairly uncommon. Each option has its advantages and disadvantages. The rate structure will have impact on the bills, but fundamentally, as I said, they will all generate sufficient revenue based on the level of service, cost of service option that has been selected. And then there's one other decision that needs to go into this is how often would you adjust the rates? Some stormwater utilities actually set it up so that you adjust the rate on an annual basis. That's pretty uncommon, but some places do that. Or you can set it to be fixed for a period of time. And with the advisory group, we looked at having it fixed over a 5-year period. So at the bottom shows where we ended up. Most members of the advisory group favor the impervious area tier-based approach. So essentially that middle one that has the very high equity versus simplicity balance. Although there are some that prefer the intensity of development approach, which is also based on tiers, but has the varies based on percent impervious. And the advisory group also wanted to have rate certainty, so they generally agreed that we should set the rate to be constant over a 5-year period. So let me give you some examples. Given all that background, what does this actually mean for a given property? This first chart is, I'll go into a bit more detail just to explain what you're seeing, but then I'll go through a series of different types of properties, different size properties to show how they vary. So this again is that typical or median single family home that was in that tier 5, 4,046 square feet. The bars show the comparison. The first three bars are essentially the 3 that we've talked about. The first one is the impervious area tier, which is where the advisory group mostly preferred. Then there's the ERU method, Then their intensity of development method, that's the comparison of the annual bill for that property. And then the last one is what would happen if you wanted to generate the same amount of revenue using an equivalent property tax, which we'll be talking about later on. Might be in the cards, maybe not. So in this case, for a single-family home, you'll see there's really not much difference between the three rate structure options. $137 for the tier method, ERUs $129, intensity development $117, and the equivalent property tax. In this instance, actually, the table has the data for this specific property. It has the assessed value of $291,000, so using that information in the impervious area, percent impervious, that's what generates the data. So again, you'll see the same basic graphic for a series of different size properties in the next few slides. So let's move to a large single-family home. In this case, has 10,046 square feet. That would put it into that large tier 8. In this particular instance, you see what the comparison is. The tier-based method, they would be looking at $306 per year. But if you go back to the ERU method, as I said, it doesn't change regardless of property size, which is why it's not as equitable. So they're still looking at the 129. You'll see that same value for other single-family homes on the next few charts. Intensity of development, 291, and the equivalent property tax for this property, 285. This is going to the other end of the spectrum, a very small single-family property. You actually see on the map there, the blue I should have pointed out, all these show the property boundaries. So in the case of this property, it's in tier 1, that smallest tier. They would be looking at $23 per year. Again, the ERU method, same value regardless of the single-family property type, same approach. Intensity of development, we'd look at $26 per year, and equivalent property tax for this property would be $41 per year. Now let's shift over to commercial properties. This is a commercial property that's relatively small, 1,620 square feet of impervious area. They would be faced with $46 per year of annual charge under the tier-based approach, so it reflects the smaller size. ERU, in this case, $52 per year. You take the impervious area divided by 4,046, you come up with their charge. Intensity of development, $47, and in this case, their equivalent property tax to raise the same amount of revenue is $51. Let's go to a large commercial property. Again, a restaurant. You'll see there's not much difference in this case between the three impervious area-based tier options. $306 per year for the tier-based approach, $320 for ERUs, $355 for intensity development. But their equivalent property tax in this instance would be considerably less to raise the same revenue. Let's shift to a commercial shopping center. This is a very large shopping center, almost 290,000 square feet. If you look on the bars, $8,800 per year under that tier-based approach, so they're basically paying based directly on their actual impervious area. Again, it's proportional. The ERU-based method is relatively proportional to the ERUs, 9,215, intensity development 10,000, but the equivalent property tax for them would be considerably less. And then we have the situation of tax-exempt properties. We're going to look a couple of those. One, a faith-based organization. This one's $2,555. You see that their charge is very similar depending on the three impervious area-based methods, ranging from $74 to $81 between the three. But because they're tax-exempt, they wouldn't pay under the equivalent property tax-based approach. And then federal government is another example. This shows what their fee would be. By the way, the federal government, there is a law that requires them to pay stormwater fees. This was passed over a decade ago. So if an impervious area-based fee were to be passed, you could assess the federal government. And this shows what their property, their charges would be under those three different methods. Impervious area tier would be about $5,800 per year, $6,000 for ERUs. And the intensity of development is lower because, again, they have a lot of green space, so their percent impervious is very low. But they're tax exempt, so they don't pay anything at all under the equivalent property tax approach. So I'm going to shift gears and talk about two other key policy issues. One is incentives and the other is exemptions fairly quickly. Credit incentive policies are almost always included in stormwater utilities. And one reason is for it to really be considered a fee, you have to have the ability to reduce your fee based on your own actions on the property. So what are the typical incentives? A credit program basically allows you to reduce your fee if you are capturing and managing a certain amount of your stormwater runoff from your property. Though you might have an infiltration trench or some other approved practice approved by the township, and you're maintaining it, it's a good working order, you should be able to get a reduction in your fee. A rebate program is, the credit program is a regular continuing reduction in your fee. It continues over time, assuming that facility is in good working order. A rebate program, essentially, if you don't have any on-site stormwater management, it gives you the ability to install those with a subsidy provided by the township. This is fairly uncommon, but becoming more common. So older properties where the regulations didn't require them to be in place, you could actually get some support from the township to install new stormwater facilities to manage them on your property. So that's the difference between those two types of mechanisms. To summarize what the proposed recommendations are, first of all, it is to create an incentive program. Probably to phase it over time, and the reason for that simply is there's a fair amount of administrative effort to stand up the program to start, but once you get it in place, you can move forward. But at first, we think it should be phased in over time. And so the recommendation is to do it as soon as possible. Typically, credit programs in other jurisdictions start out with the non-residential properties simply because they have much larger impervious area and therefore have larger fees. So to help them with the burden associated with those, and there are fewer of them, so the administrative burden is a little bit easier to figure out as you come up with additional properties come online. And then what is the maximum credit? The maximum credit is awarded if you're managing all impervious area on your property. So you first have to be able to manage, not just the parking lot, but the parking lot and the roof, the driveway. You have to manage all that impervious area. If you manage all of it, you could get the maximum credit. The recommendation is a 60% credit. So you can reduce, if you have I can't do the math, $600 a year, you get it down to $200 a year. Did I do that right? So it gives you a sense of what it is. That would be for if you're managing water quality, so it's tied to the township's water quality driven permit programs. And if you're managing quantity and quality, so flooding and runoff, you could get as much as 80%. That's the recommendation on the table. Typical range for these credits is between 25 and 75%. And that's, again, a policy choice that the township would need to make. The eligibility criterion we're suggesting is that all properties would be eligible. But you would have to apply for the credit. It's not an automatic. You have to go ahead and apply. And you have to show compliance with the township's operation and maintenance requirements for those facilities. And part of the reason for that is the credit is an incentive for you to keep it in proper working order. It doesn't do a lot of good if it's clogged and not functioning correctly. And essentially it has to also be consistent with the types of facilities that the township currently approves. Typically, you have to renew on a regular basis. So we're recommending that the renewal for residential properties be every 3 years, and that for non-residential properties, it has to be every year. So let's shift to the last policy, talk about exemptions. These are proposed recommendations at this point. And this one in particular was only briefly introduced at the last advisory group meeting, so there's still some discussion to be had. First of all, should the township itself be assessed? Well, the idea is that all non-municipal tax-exempt properties, so faith community, federal government, so forth, would all be assessed. And this is the most equitable approach. Most stormwater utilities that withstand legal challenges basically treat everyone the same. But with the one difference in this case being the township itself, some jurisdictions choose to assess themselves, others do not. That's a policy choice you have. But if you are assessing yourself, basically you're going to be transferring money from this account to that account, so there's really no net revenue. So in this moment, the recommendation is to not assess the township directly. The issue that's still needs to be discussed further has to do with roads. At the moment, the recommendation is to exempt public roads, that's both local, state, and federal, as well as railroad right-of-way. Some members of the advisory group felt that the roadway impervious area should be included and allocated to each property, so we still need to go through some analysis and discussion to figure that out. But exempting public roads is very common across most stormwater utilities around the country. One of the other issues has to do with undeeded private roads. So should those actually be assessed? In essence, the recommendation is to exempt those. They're a really small slice of all roads within the township, less than 3%. And essentially, the idea is that deeded roadways should not be exempted, but that's because they have a defined ownership. But undeeded property, it's unclear exactly who owns those properties. And I mentioned early on the whole issue of properties with a very small amount of impervious area, less than 500 square feet. You generate very, very little revenue associated with those. It's not worth the administrative costs, and sometimes they're due to mapping errors. So the idea is to not assess for anything less than 500 square feet of impervious area. So I think I'm turning it over to Joe, or no, to you.
I'll take it. Thanks. So, you know, the technical process is pretty extensive, and we're still working through some input with the advisory group. We have a meeting next week where we're going to continue our conversation. We're going to ramp back up some of our outreach. We have some public meetings, some one-on-one focus groups we have planned with some key stakeholders, and then really, you know, the idea is to develop a recommendations plan and an implementation plan in the fall before we head into the ordinance and public hearing phase. But I think, Joe, you can take it from here.
Yeah, so one of the things, and Ellen's going to touch on it, but we've had this, Westchester case looming out there, excuse me, and that's yet to be fully adjudicated. So the board is kind of facing a decision here on whether or not we continue with the fee structure and what we've been working on, or potentially swinging it back around and figuring out how to implement this, via a real estate tax. And so we're working on that. That this is kind of the kickoff to that decision-making process. We also have some other areas that we're looking at in terms of revenue studies. And so that could be in play as well. And so we're targeting, if not in a couple of weeks, definitely our June meeting where we need to make a decision, so that way staff can then work with Jacobs towards completion and implementation, as that was the direction that the board had given us, when we kicked this off, that we wanted to be ready for January 1 of 24. And so we're still on that path, but we're at those crossroads. So with that, I think we're going to turn things over to Ellen.
Thank you, Joe. Ellen Coatman, solicitor for the borough. The challenges that the township faces in terms of floodwater management, stormwater management, they're certainly not unique. And they were pretty significant as outlined by our consultants at Jacobs. And as Mr. Vandertak noted, his number was over 3,000. The number I had was over 2,000 in terms of the number of utilities, stormwater fee programs throughout the country that currently operate. So the proposed solution here is not unique. And in fact, in Pennsylvania, there are currently 58 stormwater utility fee programs that are operational. So it's not unique to Pennsylvania either. However, all of that was thrown into question with the challenge by Westchester University and their parent, the Pennsylvania Association State System of Higher Education, or PASHE. Westchester
borough implemented a stormwater utility fee much in the same vein as the one that is being proposed and considered by you here tonight. They adopted that in 2016. And then in 2017, the university advised the borough that they would not be paying the fee because, in their opinion, it was not a fee, it was a tax. And the university, as an agency of the Commonwealth, is a tax-exempt entity. Eventually, the borough filed a lawsuit against the university and asked the Commonwealth Court to declare that the university must pay the fee because it was a fee and not a tax. So after lengthy litigation, further extended due to the pandemic, eventually, very early this year in 2023, we did get a decision from the Commonwealth Court. And I think most people in this field were surprised to find that the Commonwealth Court ruled in favor of the university. And they ruled that the stormwater utility fee program that the borough had implemented was not a fee, but was actually a tax. And I'll speak very briefly about what the Commonwealth Court held in terms of their logic. They started out by differentiating between a tax and a fee. They said a tax is an enforced contribution upon many that is then spent for the benefit of the entire community, whereas a fee is paid in exchange for a specific benefit that inures to the payor. So the quote from the decision was that a charge is a tax rather than a fee for service if it is not reasonably proportional to the value or benefit received. So that is what they were honing in on when they evaluated they were calling it a charge as their neutral term due to the system that the Borough of Westchester had implemented. And ultimately they decided that the method of using impervious surface area to gauge a property owner's charge was not a fee. And they found that because in their mind, this method is not based on the benefits derived by the payor, but by the anticipated burden that the property imposes on the system. And so they determined that because the payor was not receiving a defined benefit in exchange for their payments, that it was not a fee and was actually a tax. Because Westchester University is a tax-exempt entity, it did not have to pay. So this was, in some ways, a very limited holding because it applied specifically to the university in the borough. The Borough of Westchester still has a stormwater utility fee up and running that pretty much everyone else pays into. The 57 other stormwater utilities across the Commonwealth are also still up and running. This decision did not require them to stop. However, it would be, and it's also very much worth noting that this decision by the Commonwealth Court has been appealed. The borough did appeal the decision. It is going up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. They have their briefing schedule out, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court could overturn the Commonwealth Court and say, no, we think that this is actually a proper fee and university must pay it. But it would be remiss for me not to tell you about the potential legal risks associated with pursuing this fee in light of this decision because it is currently the law. So my goal in the next few minutes is to outline what I see the options before you and the relative legal risks associated with those options so that if you do decide to move forward with this fee program, it's with your eyes wide open and understanding the associated risks, or if you choose not to, that it's an educated decision. So I think it really boils down to 4 options. First option is to stay the course and to continue moving forward with developing the utility fee program. And again, as I mentioned, although the Commonwealth Court decision in the Westchester Borough case is not binding on you, it doesn't have any specific legal impact on you, it does provide a guide or a roadmap to other property owners in this township who might want to challenge the fee. So first, it sets up the argument for landowners who, like Westchester University, are tax exempt as government entities. The major example here is the school district. They could use the same line of argument to claim that they are not subject to the fee because it is actually taxed and they are exempt from taxes. Secondly, other landowners who enjoy tax-exempt status, such as religious organizations, could argue that this same logic applies equally to them. And third, and honestly most potentially damaging to the entire concept, is that any landowner could start from the argument that the assessment based on impervious surface is not a fee but a tax due to this question of benefits received by the payor, and say that because it is a tax, it is an illegal tax, because the Commonwealth has not specifically authorized municipalities to levy taxes in this way. It's a legal matter. Townships can only impose taxes in ways that are specifically permitted by the state. And so using impervious surface to levy a tax, if you wanted to call it a tax, is not specifically authorized. So if you were to call this system of measuring each property's assessment a tax, it would be illegal. So those are the risks associated with continuing down this path with the fee program. The second option that is available to you is to think about gaining these costs that you need to raise to manage all of these capital projects and other stormwater and flooding projects that you have, is to try to make up that difference with a real estate tax based on your millage. There are no legal risks associated with this. I mean, it's how everyone has historically funded their stormwater management, is through their property taxes. And it is, certainly possible for the township to designate a particular proportion of the millage to stormwater. And so to sort of cut off the concern that, oh, you're just raising my taxes to pay for a better township building or something. No, you could say, no, we're raising this amount of money, it's going into this fund, it's for stormwater only. Much in the same way that, if you assessed a fee, the money would go directly to a stormwater account. So that is an option that is available to you that would have no legal risk. A third option is to consider moving the fee to your municipal authority. In some ways, this approach carries the same legal risks as the stay the course option because, again, the Westchester Borough decision has laid out this roadmap to argue that a fee on the basis of impervious surface area is just a tax by another name. And if the fee was found to be a tax, it's a problem for the authority because municipal authorities are not allowed to impose taxes, they are allowed to impose fees. The interesting thing about moving this fee to a municipal authority is that the Municipal Authorities Act specifically permits authorities to be formed for the purpose of stormwater planning, management, and implementation. And it specifically authorizes them to develop reasonable and uniform rates based in whole or in part on property characteristics. And in the world of land use and zoning, impervious coverage is a classic example of a property characteristic. It's also very much worth noting that a stormwater utility fee operated by a municipal authority in the city of Chester
was also challenged as a tax. That case was also held and heard by the Commonwealth Court, and in that instance, the Commonwealth Court sided with the municipal authority. They said, okay, yeah, this is a fee. It's the same court, different outcome. It's not, the two decisions aren't really resolvable. And that's, you know, certainly something that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court will be trying to sort out who was right and who was wrong there. Other considerations for the option of placing a stormwater utility fee program within a municipal authority is that the Municipal Authorities Act also specifically empowers authorities to fund flood control projects, which is sort of an added bonus, because I know that is something that you are particularly keen on addressing through this program. So that is, you know, an additional option that is available to you. The fourth option is to delay. No one wants to do that, but there are no legal risks associated with this option, and the idea would be to let the litigation play out in the Westchester Borough case and see what the Supreme Court ultimately decides. There's no way for me to tell you when a decision will come down. I do know that the briefing schedule has been set. They are supposed to have their brief, the borough is supposed to have their brief in the summer, in June. If they hold to that schedule, then the university would need to have their brief due in likely July. But again, you know, it's the courts. Things get continued, things get stalled. And even then, once argument is heard on it, the Supreme Court will have to take their time and decide what the answer is and issue decision, so it could be a while before we actually have a ruling. And then once we have a ruling, there's no guarantee that it's going to be a yes or a no. They could say, we need to send this back to Commonwealth Court. We have other questions that need to be developed on the record. You know, the waiting game is an indefinite one. It will come to an end at some point, but it is impossible for me to tell you when it would come and what kind of clarity it would provide. So that's what there's no right legal answer. You know, I can't tell you that if you go one way or another, you're going to be breaking the law or something. It's that, you know, as the township, as the board of supervisors, you need to consider what your goals are and, you know, make the choice that seems to best further those goals in light of whatever your appetite for risk is on the legal side. Before we turn it over to questions, I did also want to get in a little bit to the lens that I would encourage you and advise you to view all of the decisions that you need to make about the fee program if you decide to keep moving forward with a fee. If you decide to keep moving forward with a fee, every sort of policy decision that you make should be started on the foundation that this stormwater utility is a fee for service. The service is the management and conveyance of stormwater runoff generated by impervious surfaces. So you need to keep that in mind when you're making any kind of decision about how you want this fee structure to look. Sorry about that. And this is an important consideration in line of the debate about roads. There's been a lot of debate about the roads and in the advisory group about who's responsible for the impervious surface area of the roads. Again, this is not something that has a legal yes or no kind of answer, but here is how I would suggest that you view that question. So again, the stormwater utility is a fee for service. Service is the management and conveyance of stormwater runoff generated by impervious surfaces. The customer who's participating in this program is the property owner who is charged a fee based on the amount of impervious surface on their property. So if the question is who is responsible for the stormwater runoff generated by the road, the answer is the owner of the road. As soon as you start to consider allocating the costs of managing the stormwater runoff of any particular impervious surface to anyone other than the property owner, you are undermining the premise of the program as a fee-for-service. So you as board, as the policy matter, could decide to exempt certain roads from the program. But once you start attempting to shift costs away from the property owner, even if it's for a well-intentioned reason like equity, the program stops functioning as a fee-for-service. So that's just one example of the way that this fee-for-service lens should be applied to the policy decisions that you would make if you move forward with this stormwater utility fee. And the reason why I am emphasizing this so strongly is that, again, if you pursue this fee program in the current legal environment, it needs to be very well grounded in this idea that the payors receive a benefit and it is reasonably proportioned to the amount that they pay. And there's good, the logic behind using impervious surface is a strong one. Again, as I said, a lot of us in this field were kind of surprised when the Commonwealth Court came down on the other side of this. There's a lot of decisions out there from other states that came the other way. But this is the decision we have. This is the decision that we have to keep in mind as you move forward. And to just be safe, to really ground this as a fee, just keep that framework in mind as you're moving forward and developing the program, if that's what you choose to do. So again, I think that at this point, it's questions. And I don't know who's going to MC that.
I'm going to go with one question since you opened it up. And there's one thing you didn't mention, which is, so if we were to implement this as a tax, just a regular millage tax, is there any risk to pivoting back to a fee, assuming the Supreme Court gives us a favorable ruling and we have some rules we can follow?
I don't think so. Okay. No, I think that you've got some great groundwork laid by the advisory committee and Jacobs so that you could pivot. I mean, it would be the lift for your staff to make, but the groundwork is there, and legally, I don't think there's any problem with
that. I was just going to say, any other board questions or comments?
I had a question, and I guess this is for Jacobs. On page 19, the slide number 38, where it says single-family residential median, the fourth bar on the graph shows the equivalent property tax needed to raise the same amount of money that the fee could. And so my question is, were the tax-exempt properties pulled out of the equation before this number was determined?
Yes.
Thank you.
Right.
Simply going to say that we took the entire assessable tax base, and to generate the same revenue, we came up with a tax rate and then applied it to each property.
Thanks. I did understand your answer, but I appreciate you clarifying it for other people who weren't as drilled into it. Thank you.
I just want to briefly thank Jacobs and Ms. Koopman for all of the hard work you've done so far and presenting this to us and the public. Do we have any other comments or questions from our board?
Well, I would just emphasize the point you just made, which was I've been on all the task force of the committee meetings, and these guys have done a great job, and you've done a great job in presenting what is a fairly complicated topic, and what you're seeing here today is synthesized down from a lot of meetings and pretty well presented. So thank you very much, you guys, and you also, thank you.
And I also want to thank all of the members of the advisory group for taking the time. It's been a lot of meetings, and we really appreciate everyone's participation. Do we have any questions or comments from the public? Come on up and please state your name and your address before you speak.
Madam Chair, as we go through this, Madam Chair, real quick, I know there's one, we'll do public and then if there's any virtual kind of, so we do cover both sides. Okay, I'll let you know we have one up already.
Yeah, my name is Ian Olschlegel at 504 Cheswold Court in Chesterbrook. First, I just want to reiterate what David said, and Ellen, you guys did a great job. I can appreciate the thoroughness of some of these slides, and I think for a matter of this detail, you really need 50 slides to go through it. We might have gone through rather quickly, but hopefully people were able to look through them, and if they can't, they were on there. My first question really is, how was Jacobs found, and how did they come up with the list that's on slide 19? I don't know if we can show slide 19 on. And I'm going to sit down so I don't block the behind, and then I'll get right back up where.
Can you just tell me which slide?
Slide 19.
Oh, there, okay. List of projects.
The list of capital projects.
That list is, great question, that list is directly from the township's budget list of projects. We just extracted the ones that were stormwater related.
Gotcha. Second question, if you could show slide 29, could you update the presentation and put a map that pertains to the location of all of the projects that equal $22 million? Because with a background in mapping, I could easily argue that everything is on the other side of 202, if you're familiar with, the whole area. And generally speaking, a quick search of Richards and Glen Hardy and Weedley and just about 90% of the projects on slide 19, none of them are in Chesterbrook.
We do have a map. We have prepared a map because, and I was actually kicking myself just before the meeting that why didn't we put this map in? But they're fairly well distributed in the township. But yes, that map can be provided, certainly.
I would say most of them are on the south side of 202, running east and west on the upper hill. I don't see one that is closer than 2 miles from where we stand tonight. Arguably maybe one or two. But again, I'm from Chesterbrook, so I'm using this slide here. I want to highlight some of the commercial. This gentleman here talked about some of the software that was used. Being in Chesterbrook, I could tell you that there's close to 200 acres of open space labeled as commercial. Can you speak to that?
Yes, if you go to the previous slide or two slides before, you're only being assessed for the impervious area within the property bounds. So that might show the full extent of property lines that would be called single-family residential, but you're only assessed on the impervious surface, roads, buildings, parking lots within those boundaries.
So we went to slide 20.
Here, the orange and red is essentially what you're being assessed on.
So if we could go to slide 28, the graph on the right, does slide 28 include the 200 acres that's labeled commercial, but really is undeveloped land? Or is it?
It would include just the impervious surfaces associated with that property. If there's no impervious surfaces in those acreage, it would not be part of the 36% that's shown on that chart.
So we break out things like Wilson Farm Park under local government in the top right of that pie chart, 3.8%. If you could go back to slide 29, slide 29 differentiates local government as a turquoise color, and then the commercial color is bright red. Could we add another color that would just take out the open space and then maybe redo the graph?
Well, you get the same result in terms of those pie charts. I mean, the one on the right is just the impervious area within each of those broader categories.
Right.
So let's just make up an example. Pick any one of those. Assume it's got 100 acres. If it actually had a parking lot in a building that's 5 acres, so 5 out of 100, only 5% or that 5 acres would show up in that right-hand pie chart.
Okay. And last question, second to last question. If I look at this, I see a bunch of orange called multifamily, and I'm actually living in a multifamily known as a condominium association. When I compare all the orange just visually, it looks like roughly about 14 parcels that are rather anywhere from 10 acres to maybe as little as 3 acres. And I compare that to the blue, which are parks, Friendship Park, Wilson Farm Park. If you could go back to slide 28, when you do the amount of pervious to impervious, you really don't have any of the blue under local government, and then you have this huge segment of multifamily, 7.7. Although a lot of the condominium associations really have just open space that's not paved. So I question the validity of the impervious surface chart because I'm just doing a quick read, knowing the software that measures some of this. It's the business that I'm in, and I'm starting to question the data. So maybe that could get looked at.
I think we can prepare, or we can present the impervious area map at a large scale, so you can kind of zoom in and look at it. Yeah, and drill in.
That would be great.
And it is publicly available data from the Regional Planning Commission, and I'm pretty sure it's 2015. So it's not necessarily precise for exact changes that may have occurred since then.
Well,
But just
2015
to
is pretty
be,
outdated for
but the
software.
plan would be, if this were passed, we would update the mapping information with the last 5 years of data.
Okay.
Or 7 years of data.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Just to emphasize what you're talking about. I mean, I live in Chesterbrook. I know this pretty well. I mean, some of the things that you have labeled as commercial here are clearly multifamily or parcel 1 and parcel 19 open space. So it's just a labeling concern, that's all.
And those labels come right from the tax assessment, like the county parcels, and they certainly should and could be refined based on specific land uses. But the land uses themselves aren't really related to the fee that is charged to the property owner.
Well,
It's
maybe
just
David can attest, parcel 19 and 1 doesn't pay any county tax. Right, so to use that, suggest that's how it got on the list.
Anyway, I think that just to be clear, these guys, and we just spent a lot of time talking about how it's assessed, and they think they can get it down to the specific impervious surface on the property. But for public use, it is, now that I look at it carefully, it's super confusing to have some of this stuff labeled commercial when, like, we know it's drainage dishes and open space. So that's I think the point that is the problem, yeah.
Let me just jump in for a minute. A quick comment. You know, this is probably not a very efficient way to drill down on the data in a group like this, but I think that certainly, you know, if the data is available, you know, we should feel, anyone, you, you know, especially since you're a GIS person, you said, you know, you should drill down on the data and analyze it, and if that turns out to be, instead of 35%, if it turns out to be 37% or 33% or whatever, that's something that we can work through the details. But
Sure.
Right now, you know, we should be talking concept rather than looking at the details.
Right. So my last 2 points, and maybe David can speak to, private roads. I'm in a condominium association where I hear that we would be assessed within our boundary. So I have 5 acres. We have about 1.5 acres of asphalt, and we have 32,000 square feet roughly of buildings. So to hear private roads would be assessed, but public roads would not.
There's as you've heard a couple
Sure.
times, there's a whole discussion about this. This is you know, 50-yard line. There's a lot of half a game to go. Yeah.
Understood.
So, yeah.
I just want the comments to be open. Last comment is, most of Chesterbrook is, call it about 30 communities. Some are HOAs, some are condominium associations, and most of them in the early 80s, when they were subdeveloped, all got dispersed with detention basin agreements. And so just about all of Chesterbrook is already maintaining stormwater management within their basins. So to hear that we have another assessment, and couple that with my first point, we have a map potentially that I would argue that is not anywhere near Chesterbrook, and we're already paying money for what we believe is stormwater detention management. It's kind of feeling like we're getting double hit. So I understand this, we're at the 50-yard line. We'll take this, you know, give everyone benefit of the doubt and say it's a long work in progress, but, I appreciate all your guys' time. I just wanted to make those comments, so thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that for a second, there's two things you've said that I want to comment to. One is in terms of, I live in Green Hills, as you know. We have a lot of stormwater stuff we support, and I would expect that when this gets implemented, assuming, depending on the structure, if there's an opportunity to apply for credits, we would then apply for credit for our development. So that's just, I think that's what's going to happen. Your point on the projects, though, that there's no projects in Chesterbrook. There actually is the culvert under Chesterbrook Boulevard, that retaining wall that's collapsing. That's not on the list because it's going to start this summer. So that's already in the process and being paid for. So just so you know, there's going to be a bunch of digging in Chesterbrook for stormwater. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you. I think we're going to now move to an online question, and then we will move to the next in person.
Hi, Bob Wilson, 701 Strawbridge Lane. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Same question about the map. I just think it's confusing to show all these areas. We live in Tredyffrin, and there's a large amount of area that's shown as commercial. I really would suggest that some other designation can be used because we don't have any commercial area. I think that's a question. Just a comment, reiterating what was raised last time. Secondly, how does something get into the project list? It's a general question. We've had some discussions with the township. Can't remember who it was, but we have a severe water problem here, and found that there's nothing in the projects to deal with it. And just curious if we're going to start down this path and start, which I applaud, funding these projects. They're really important to get done. Just a question: how does a project get on the list? Because it seems that my guess is there's probably a lot more projects that haven't been considered beyond what's already on that very detailed list. And I think that might be something from a process point of view, you might want to consider before we lock ourselves into a funding mechanism for a defined set of projects, that we really open this up and make sure we have all the projects considered. And I know there's a small fund here. I think about 10% or so of the project budget, which is undefined at this point, but I would guess that's not nearly enough. And my guess is this is something that's going to grow, not shrink over time. So I think there's a need for other projects to be considered. Certainly we have them in our area. Need to understand how that gets onto the list, and then how do you adjust the list as time goes on. So those are my comments. Thank you.
I think I can maybe jump in to add some comments in regards to the general question that was asked, or the specific question about stormwater projects. So there's two initial ways that some of these projects were identified. One, known and long-standing issues that the townships had for flooding and other stormwater concerns. So there was a list of projects. There was also the Board of Supervisors going back to, I think it was 2019. They had brought together a stormwater task force group who had looked and across the township at a variety of stormwater issues and pulled together a number of township stormwater concerns throughout all the different watersheds in Tredyffrin Township, and listed those projects. So some of those projects are also incorporated into that listing we have. It's a defined period of time of projects, and over time, yes, it will grow as different projects are identified further in the future, as further infrastructure, degrades and needs to be identified as things like that. So, and the township residents obviously can respond to the township staff and the board with any concerns or comments they have, as always.
Real quick, I'll just add, one of the other tasks that we actually have in our 5-year capital plan is, it's something that we've been talking about, that the board specifically has been pushing, to develop a stormwater master plan. And so that's one of our next tasks in this grand scheme after we have this mechanism implemented and underway. We can then turn our attention to developing that master plan. And that, again, the idea is to look at the township as a whole, and you do you balance. It's a balancing act. What's going to provide big impacts for again the broad scope of you have our MS4 project, which is water quality. Then we'll have our flood reduction projects, and again, we've talked about this quite a bit, and when we identify projects, we try to do projects that hit both of those. And so that master plan will help identify projects for the next, quite frankly, probably several decades that it's going to take to get through them, but that'll just help the board.
Just one other thing to add to what Joe was just saying is that master plan was identified on that previous slide 19 that we had. So there was identified cost in that capital program and planning program for stormwater.
Just a good resource for the public is the Stormwater Task Force document, which is available on the Township website. There's a lot of good information there if you want to see where the projects are, and it's kind of a list. So that's important. The other thing is as Steve said, this is a working list. It's going to keep evolving. But also remember, we're not going to pay for all this. Like Steve has been very, very successful in writing for grants. So there's other money that does come into the system from grants, assuming they're available for some of these projects. So that's also part of what can move projects higher or lower on the list, is if someone else is willing to pay for part of it. So just to understand that's part of the process here.
Come on up.
I don't know how to. Okay, can you hear me now? All right. I'm Winnie Shaw Hope. I live at 332 Brigade Court in the Paddock in Chesterbrook. And this probably sounds a little naive, but it wasn't totally clear to me. You did talk some about the homeowners associations. And are you considering they're going to pay the fee and they're going to pass it on to the residents in the homeowners associations, or are you going to be assessing each unit in the condo association?
We haven't made a firm decision, but we assessed both options based on some input from the advisory group. And it seemed like they're leaning towards sending the bills directly to homeowners, but you then have to figure out how to distribute the common area to those. But they're
Right.
both options are on the table, that both can be accommodated.
All right. Well, I think what you said, you're having focus groups, and I think major outreach to the condo association boards is definitely a priority to have their input. The other thing is, in all these common areas and I guess what's considered deeded private roads, if there's some incentive to do things, I can think of a lot of things that can be done in the parking lot of my condo association to mitigate the impermeable sources and really increase a lot of our permeable sources. So I'm going to be putting pressure on them, but I think a lot of education needs to get done. But I also want to conclude with, we all live downstream and we are all affected by the watershed and stormwater management, and I just really want to thank you for taking this on and really doing a lot of work. I think it was mentioned, a lot of deferred maintenance of things that haven't been done for years, and thank you very much for looking at that.
Thank you. Do we have another online or no? Okay, all right, come on up.
Thank you very much. My name is Les Bear. I live at 318 at Bevan Road in Wayne Glen. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association at Wayne Glen. And I think this board, as well as certainly your township engineer, is very familiar with our very sophisticated stormwater management program. We're only 2 years old. Our basins were just finished last year. We have 10 basins, we have a regional basin, and we have a dam, all at the expense of the Homeowners Association. And I think you probably know where I'm going with this. We assess each homeowner $400 a year based on direction from this township to be put into a reserve account to continue to engineer, maintain, and have a very active operational program in that system. I think your engineer can probably attest we are very diligent about adhering to that program. We send him reports every 3 weeks when an engineer comes on site to inspect our basins at a cost of about $500 to $700 every inspection. Our operating costs are $37,000 for the contribution to the reserve account, and in addition to that, another $30,000 for maintenance annually. And I guess when I see your program tonight, I'm enlightened the fact that you're really taking this on. This is a big project. This is huge for you, and it's going to take a lot of time, and I think it's necessary. But I think you need to consider something other than just impervious surface as a requirement if you go fee-based, and I think you should be fee-based so that the credits can be delivered to those people who are doing the job. But let's think about how we're going to implement this. It's a yeoman's job as to all the different iterations. You have Chesterbrook. You have places like Wayne Glen. I'd like to think that Wayne Glen is probably one of a kind in your township. I don't think anyone else has as sophisticated a system as we do. Your engineer touted it as being one of the first in the state. And I think that's probably the case and continues to be the case as being very sophisticated. All the runoff water from our 30 acres go into those 10 basins and does not leave the site. We are not adding to the issue. In fact, your officials were very complimentary after the storms in 2021 about what we did to retain the water on site and not destroy the homes that were downstream. And prior to the implementation of that program that we have, you had huge problems. Walker Road would be closed every storm, and the homes downstream would be vacated for periods of time until they were renovated again. None of that happened in 21 because of what we've done and paid for. We spent over $2 million that were embedded in our purchase prices to build that system. You have to take that into consideration when you're developing this and consider the fact of the expense that we've already paid. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Don Williams, 851 Richards Road. About 11 years ago, this room was filled with people objecting to or commenting on the Duckworth development up on Walker Road and Glen Hardy. And at that time, I noted that stormwater infrastructure was being built based on the U.S. government's NOAA Rainfall Atlas, and that atlas is based on rainfall from the past 100 years and is not taken into account the increased rainfall we're receiving. At that time, I know we'd had 3 100-year rainstorms within the previous 20 years. And so I'm wondering, as a question, when you guys are looking at the stormwater infrastructure building, are you still using the rainfall atlas? And if so, are you not building undersized infrastructure that will be difficult to upgrade later? Or are you taking into account the increased rainfall that's projected here for the next 30 years?
Well, first of all, that's a question for each individual project, but you're spot on. I'll take my other hat on within Jacobs. I'm our Water Resilience Director for the Americas. I oversee our climate change response practice. So everything you said makes me very happy that someone here is very conscious of climate change and the need to update design criteria to reflect not only changes that have occurred, which, by the way, NOAA, you may know, is updating their Atlas 14 design statistics. What I advocate usually when looking at projects that have a 50-year service life is you should be not only looking for the updated storm. So if you're designing for a 10-year storm, that should reflect what it's going to be 50 years from now if that infrastructure has to last 50 years. So right now, that's not something we've gone through individual project-wise, but hopefully when we get into moving forward and designing projects, we should do exactly as you suggest.
Okay, thank you. And regarding the solicitor's comment about assessing the fees, I personally think that the Pennsylvania Turnpike should be assessed the fee for its impervious cover, and it's a private organization, not a government, a local government or state government. Although I suppose lawyers can debate that question. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, you coming up?
Ray Clark from Overlook Place in Melbourne, and co-chair with Anne Murphy on the Stormwater Task Force, which was part of the process here. So I'm really pleased that we're having this discussion. Grateful to see so many people from the community turning out and online here. So clearly the interest remains, despite the fact we've had a very dry spring. So just a couple of things. The Jacobs presentation was, very thorough and kind of built up from kind of the demand side. And I think I'm going to encourage the board to kind of come at it the other way from the supply of money side. How, as you kind of overlay the infinite list of projects that can be done, what is it reasonable to expect residents to be able to afford? We have the school district looking to charge us for building a new elementary school, a new athletic fields. We have talks of changing the way the fire companies are funding. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of imposition on residents here. So thinking very hard about, what's practical to afford is kind of one important thing. The second is, what is practical that the township can actually implement? If we had $10 million a year from a stormwater fee, could we actually spend that effectively? Probably not. So thinking about how much money we can effectively spend and what it will take to manage that spend, and to get to the master plan comment, to prioritize and have this kind of complete plan. You need to have the administration side to manage the money that's coming in. So balancing all of that is really going to be your challenge, I think. And then making sure that in that master plan are the things that actually residents can look at and say, that's going to make a difference. And maybe it's more small plans than big bridge rehabilitations. Maybe those kind of things could be outside of the stormwater fee. I don't know. But thinking that the task force spent a lot of time, thanks to Supervisor Baska, coming up with a prioritization matrix that kind of matched what's easy to do and what has the biggest impact, and trying to identify the projects in that top right of the matrix. So spending time to administer the money and administer it effectively is going to be really important as you think through all of this. One comment about credits. That's a kind of a tricky thing, it seemed to me, because I think you want to be very careful about offering credits to people who are doing just what the township ordinance requires. It's when people go above and beyond, and perhaps the Richter Tract Wayne Glen Basin is going above and beyond. That's a regional stormwater control basin there. That clearly could be above and beyond. But for routine meeting the requirements, I think we've got to be very careful about credits. And there's great publicly available data on impervious surface on a county product called Chesco Views. So you can, open that up, click on the impervious surface table of contents, and you can see exactly I don't know if it's the 2015 data, probably is, about what's currently in the databases for impervious. So, thanks very much.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comments online or in person? All right, come on up.
Hello, I'm Richard Cunin. I live over in the Glen Hardy section at the bottom of the watershed. I'm well aware of the problems people who are even lower down geographically than I am have every time it rains. It's a pain in the neck, to say the very least. And it's really very nice to know that we're doing something about it. I was kind of wondering about the cost for all of this stuff and how it's being paid, or the thinking about how it's going to be paid. And it occurred to me that if a person wants to, well, first of all, the township, of course, we know requires very stringent stormwater management on the part of property owners. If a person wants to expand a patio, for example, the property owner needs to submit a plan and has to include appropriate stormwater management. Okay, fine. I'm not arguing that point. That's fine. And it needs to be done. The problem is, if the township is going to impose a fee or a tax or whatever the revenue source is going to be called, and then the property owner has to pay an additional cost for additional stormwater control on his own property, and then the property owner is charged for additional impervious surface, he's being charged 3 times, in effect. Now, I'm not asking for an answer to a question like that. It's kind of convoluted, I think. And it's not the sort of thing that you can answer right here, right in this spot. It requires discussion and conversation, I understand. But I did want to bring it up because I did receive an e-letter in today's email, for example, for instance, that presented that very same problem. Person wants to expand a patio and needs to provide certain stormwater management, and is complaining, and I've heard this from other people, that the management system is more expensive than the patio. So, where are we? We have to think about how we're charging for the current impervious surface, what we're charging someone to, shall we say, increase the impervious surface, therefore we're charging him for his liability that he's creating himself. I don't know whether it's a good idea or not. I mean, to create the liability. But then we're also going to charge him additionally for more impervious surface. So it's just a question that I decided I needed to ask, and that people who are in charge of this, responsible for this kind of stuff, will please think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like Mr. Clark is coming back up.
Yes. Sorry, I just have one thought in response to Richard's comment there. Clearly you feel that, okay, I'm already paid to install my stormwater control for my impervious surface, but that stormwater control under the ordinance only takes you to like a 2-year storm. And the fact you have more impervious will give you more runoff in these extraordinary storms. So it's almost a little fair. So.
I know there are a lot of problems involved that we have to think about, and that's I just brought it up for discussion. Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify again. I think I heard, so the software that was used to generate some of this data was 2015. Go ahead.
The data used as an input into the analysis, I think was 2015. I have to double check that, but it was the freely available from Chester County, i.e. Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission.
I figured I'd get up just to give you a little background. I have a family-owned business, a second-generation owner, and we're in snow removal. I also have a degree in telecommunications, and I'll get to why I'm saying that. We've been doing snow removal for 50 years, and I would argue that in 1990 we would go out and measure things with a roller tape. In 2010, we would use Google Earth. If I used a 2015 to measure million square foot properties, shopping centers, I would be out of a job. There is software out there well beyond 2015, arguably even 2022, that can map to the square inch a property that's the Gateway Shopping Center, Town Center, King of Prussia Mall, that overnight I could put in an address and the next day it would spit out the data. So I'd be happy to show you some of that software. The reason I tell you that I'm in telecommunications is I would give you the illustration that in 15 years ago, we were all using DSL line on a home phone. We're in the DSL line here for using 2015 data. Nobody's using DSL. We're on high-speed internet. We're on fiber optics. So I would hope that we could try and get the data refreshed so that it would resemble more of less than 8-year data. Thanks.
If I could respond really quickly, you're absolutely right. As I alluded to before, there is, in my career, I've been working in stormwater utilities for 30 years. The first one I did was with one of those old roller tapes, and you'd measure like 5% of single-family homes, determining the RU. That's why they got assessed everybody the same, because the technology wasn't there. Now use satellite imagery or aerial flyovers. They use infrared technology to do exactly as you say, measure things. Just the last flyover was back in 2015. So if we were to go ahead and make this update, if the board chooses to move forward, we would do exactly as you say. We would fill in all the gaps of what's happened between 2015 and today. Pick up the additional impervious surfaces that have occurred in the meantime.
I wanted to comment on Mr. Coonan's questions. Is your concern, it sounded like to me that a person gets credits for, even if they expand their patio and they're required to put in a drainage system, that they get credit for that when the fee is assessed, correct?
I would imagine so. That's what it sounded like during the presentation.
Right.
That a person should or reasonably would get credit for a system that he installs. But the person still has to pay for that installation. I have no idea what it costs to dig. I had a trench dug in my yard for a purpose, a necessary purpose. It was up 30 feet long. It cost me $1,000 just to dig the trench. I can't imagine what piping and all that other kind of stuff that you need for a stormwater system would cost. It could really be horrendous. I have no idea because it's just something new to me. And we're not expanding our patio.
It is very expensive, I can tell you that, because we put one in our backyard. We weren't required to, but we had a huge area that always flooded, like a pond, and it's several $1,000s. Very expensive.
Yeah, and over time, I imagine there would be, if the person is granted a credit, over time, he would recoup the cost of the stormwater system, but then it still has to be maintained, and it's a phenomenal problem as far as I'm concerned to figure all this stuff out. Good for you. I mean, really, I'm not kidding. Yeah. But it's just something I felt needed to be mentioned. And of course, we have to consider whether or not the patio is increased by an impervious surface or a pervious surface, and how much water a pervious surface will allow to infiltrate as opposed to an unpaved surface and all of that kind of thing. I'm not good enough at that kind of stuff to figure it out. I understand. I know their problem. Please just accept the idea that it's something that needs to be discussed, and I hope it does continue to come up in conversation.
Okay. My next question is for Jacobs again. When y'all were talking about managing the water off residents' driveways, how would they do that? How do you manage the water that flows down your driveway? Because it said everything had to be, all-encompassing.
I should clarify that Lawrence was just saying that if you wanted to get a credit for that portion of the property, you would have to manage it. If you only managed, say, your rooftop, which is typically a lot easier to manage, then you would get credit for that portion. So it may be that a lot of properties can't manage 100% in some reasonable way because a lot of times the driveway is draining into the street and it's hard to capture. But but you could get credit for whatever portions you could capture.
So can you give us an example of how somebody would manage the water flowing down their driveway?
Well, one easy example is I can look to Lawrence because he has a permeable paver driveway, and so no runoff leaves his driveway whatsoever. And so that would be one example. Another one would be to put in a trench drain at the bottom and to channel it into a rain garden. It would be another example. But it does get, a lot of properties, it does get difficult. But again, you could get credit for 100% of what you do manage. It's just if you want to get 100% credit of your entire pervious, then you would have to manage 100% of that.
Regarding water running down the driveway, my property is at the bottom of the watershed, as I mentioned a moment ago. I have runoff coming down to my property from Stevens Drive, above that Gulf Road, and above that the ridge through Valley Forge Park. You know, the road that comes from 363 over to the Arch. Now, all of that water ultimately comes into my backyard. We have in the backyard a pervious pipe which extends the length of the house and collects groundwater that runs down from all of those heights behind us to the north of our property. All of that water ultimately exits that pipe at the driveway. Now, this is really a heavy-duty problem, I think, because I could see myself being charged for runoff from who knows how many square acres of property to the north of my property that do not belong to me and over which I have no control, all running down through my driveway, quite literally. I'm not exaggerating, but it's quite literally, because water runs through that pipe for hours after a heavy-duty rainstorm. And regarding heavy-duty rainstorms, people talked about 100-year storms. In the past 100 years, I think we've had 8 or 6 or 8 500-year storms. I don't remember exactly, but in the past 20 years, we've had 5 of them. So it is increasing. It's not 100-year storms we need to think about. It's 500-year storms. And the problem is the limited thinking on the part of the people who are writing ordinances, who are discussing only what has been, not what can be. We need to look into the future. You talk about the future in all kinds of ways. Planning this, planning that, 10-year plans for this, 10-year plans for that. But let's talk about 10-year plan for increased climate change, which is bringing increased rainfall. Let's think about that as well. It's very important. I've got all this water running down my driveway, and you're going to charge me for it, even though I have no control over it. That's not reasonable. Let's think about ways to handle this kind of stuff and solve these problems even for individual home property owners who love living in the township, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other citizen comments?
Good evening. I'm Pat McHugh. I live in Sterling Drive in Tredyffrin Township. I sent a letter to the township, to the supervisors, just outlining my concerns as a resident. And I think it echoes on some other residents' concerns that have been already spoken tonight. That is, we have people like myself moved from the city to the suburbs, and we manage our impervious driveway. For instance, when we had a shed installed, we made sure it wasn't on a concrete slab. It was in fact on stone, so that way, going in the future, the water drains into the stone. So with that, we think we would be able to get a credit because we have been conscientious of the runoff. And I think there's a lot of residents like myself who are aware of this, like rain barrels coming off the roof for our gardens. And I think if you look at it, it does add up. So with that, I do understand the concern, and I also have to take a step back and think, whatever happened to caveat emptor? Maybe it's not really popular, but we specifically bought a property so that it wasn't in a flood area. My sister bought a place in Havertown. She has flood insurance. She's responsible for that because she knew that it's a flood area. We're all in this together. I have no problem to pay more and help out other people, but I think if we're really talking about equitable taxes, I think you're taxing people who have been fair-minded about the issue. So just want to add to that. And like I said, I put it in writing to the supervisors so they have it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other citizen comments tonight? Okay.
I don't mean to keep you guys, but I just had one thing after this gentleman came up. I had talked earlier about Chesterbrook has a lot of basin agreements that each community is required to maintain a basin. Our basin is actually not on our property, and it gets maintained every so often, and we have engineers that take a look at it. What we've run into recently is that public road water has eroded all of the work that we've put in over the years because the public road has 2 drains on it. It's the only 2 drains between Lee Road and Bradford Road. They don't get cleaned. That water comes down and the drains are clogged. It erodes over the berm, and now it has washed away everything that the private community has done. So I think I'll probably be working closely with somebody at the township, try and remedy that sort of thing. But I'm on the board for our community, and to speak for 65 homes, if I will for a moment, I think that they would probably say, wait a minute, we do contribute already to a basin management. We're being assessed here for additional water. And on top of that, we also contribute to parcel 19, which potentially could have some small assessment as well, depending on if they have impervious surface. So 2, if not maybe 3, charges could pop up for monthly assessments for a condo association. And the second one would be arguably from public road water, not even our own water. So I think the community is going to probably say, wait a minute here. And so we'll probably need a meeting about it, but just take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments tonight? All right. Thanks everyone for coming out. Our next Board of Supervisors meeting is May 22nd. Note that that is a week later than normal due to the primary elections. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right. We are adjourned.